a thing that comes into it from having read the book a few times. You read the book a few times, and yeah, it's just like the resurrection of the Christ.
Most people who grew up with a Bible on their shelf have never thought to ask a question. Complete according to whom? The Bible most of the Western world knows, 66 books, Protestant tradition, or 73, with the Catholic editions, feels like a finished object. A closed box. Something handed down whole. But travel to the highlands of Ethiopia, into the round stone churches carved into cliffs, and the monasteries that have operated continuously for over 1,000 years, and you'll find a different Bible entirely. Not a variant translation. Not a regional paraphrase. A different canon, 81 books, some of which the rest of Christendom has never formally accepted, a few of which most Western readers have never even heard of. This isn't a conspiracy. It isn't a secret. Scholars have known about it for over a century. But it rarely reaches ordinary people, and when it does, it usually arrives wrapped in exaggeration, viral claims about 88 lost books, fake prophecies attributed to ancient manuscripts, quotes invented and pinned on celebrities who never said them. The real story doesn't need any of that. The real story is about a church that grew up outside the reach of Rome, kept writing in a language almost no one else on earth could read, and as a result held on to scriptures that vanished everywhere else. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the Oriental Orthodox churches alongside the Coptic Church of Egypt, the Armenian Apostolic Church, and a handful of others, recognizes a biblical canon of 81 books. 46 in the Old Testament, 35 in the New. That makes it the largest biblical canon maintained by any major Christian tradition in the world. To be precise about what 81 means, the Ethiopian Church itself has never issued one single universally agreed list. Different Ethiopian scholarly traditions arrive at 81 by counting things differently, sometimes splitting a book into two, sometimes folding several church order texts together under one heading. This isn't evidence of confusion or fraud, and it isn't a scandal. It reflects something honest. Canon formation in Ethiopia happened gradually, through synods, teachers, and commentaries on the law code known as the Fethanagast, rather than through single ecumenical vote the way many people imagine Western canon formation worked. Scholars who specialize in this field, people like Roger Cowley, who spent decades cataloging Ethiopian canon lists, and Ethiopian religious historian Ephraim Isaac, a genuine, respected translator of ancient Ethiopic texts, have written about this complexity directly. It's part of the historical record, not something anyone had to hide. What matters for our purposes is simpler. Alongside all the books familiar to Western readers, Genesis, Exodus, the Psalms, the Gospels, the letters of Paul, the Ethiopian canon includes a cluster of texts that dropped out of every other major Christian tradition. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees. 3 books called Maccabean, sometimes mistranslated as Ethiopian Maccabees, even though their content has almost nothing to do with the Maccabees known elsewhere. And in the New Testament portion, a set of church order texts, the Synodos, the Book of the Covenant, the Ethiopic Didascalia, and writings attributed to Clement, that function more like constitutional documents for how the early church organized itself than like prophecy or apocalyptic literature. None of this was buried in a cave. Much of it has been sitting in published academic translations for over a century. The reason most people have never encountered it isn't suppression. It's that almost nobody teaches Guizi, the ancient liturgical language these texts survive in, and Western seminary curricula built themselves around the Latin Vulgate and the Hebrew Masoretic tradition, not the Ethiopic one. To understand why Ethiopia ended up with a different Bible, you have to go back to the 4th century, to the Kingdom of Aksum, in what's now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. The traditional account recorded by the Roman-era historian Rufinus tells of a Syro-Phoenician Christian named Frumentius who was shipwrecked on the Red Sea coast and eventually rose to a position of influence at the Aksumite royal court. Frumentius later traveled to Alexandria, where the great Bishop Athanasius, yes, the same Athanasius famous for his role in the fight against Arianism and for writing an influential list of New Testament books in his 39th Festal letter of 367 AD. Consecrated him as the first bishop of Ethiopia. That consecration created a bond between the Ethiopian Church and the Alexandrian, Coptic, Patriarchate that lasted roughly 16 centuries, until the Ethiopian Church finally became fully autonomous in the mid-20th century. So Ethiopia's Christianity has deep, documented roots, arriving at almost the same time Christianity was being formalized across the Roman world, and doing so through a real historical relationship with Alexandria, one of the most important Christian intellectual centers of antiquity. This is worth pausing on because a lot of viral content implies Ethiopia's Christian tradition was somehow separate from or hostile to the official early church. It wasn't. It was, if anything, deeply connected to Alexandria, one of the most theologically serious cities in the ancient Christian world. What made Ethiopia different wasn't isolation from Christianity's origins. It was geography and politics. Ethiopia sat outside the borders of the Roman Empire. Its scriptures were translated not into Latin or even primarily from Hebrew, but from Greek translations into Guizi, the classical language of Aksum, a language that, like Latin in Europe, eventually stopped being spoken day to day, but remained the language of the liturgy, learning, and manuscript copying for the church. Because Ethiopia was never absorbed into the Roman imperial administrative and legal system the way Christian communities in Europe and North Africa eventually were, and because the country was never colonized by a European power the way virtually every other African nation was during the 19th and 20th centuries, Ethiopia successfully repelled an Italian invasion at the Battle of Adwa in 1896 and endured only a brief Italian occupation from 1936 to 1941. Its religious institutions had an unusually long, unbroken run of self-governance. Monasteries kept copying manuscripts in Guizi across centuries with far less external disruption than churches elsewhere experienced. That's the actual mechanism behind why these texts survived in Ethiopia specifically. Not secrecy, continuity. Here's a place where a lot of popular retellings go wrong, and it's worth correcting directly. The Council of Nicaea, held in 325 AD, is often described online as the meeting where church leaders chose the books of the Bible and threw out everything inconvenient. That's not what Nicaea was about. Nicaea's central business was the Arian controversy, the debate over whether Jesus was of the same substance as God the Father, which produced the original core of the Nicene Creed. The New Testament canon wasn't formally settled there, and it wasn't settled at any single meeting. It emerged over roughly 3 centuries through the overlapping judgments of bishops, regional synods, like the Synod of Laodicea in the 360s, and influential letters like Athanasius's 367 AD Festal Letter, which is the earliest surviving document to list exactly the 27 books that make up the New Testament as most churches recognize it today. Even after that, different regions kept somewhat different practices for generations. Nobody at Nicaea sat in a room and voted the Book of Enoch out of existence. What actually happened is subtler and honestly more interesting. As the New Testament's core list stabilized in the Greek and Latin-speaking world across the 4th and 5th centuries, certain older Jewish and Jewish Christian writings, texts that had circulated widely in the 1st and 2nd centuries, gradually stopped being copied, stopped being taught, and eventually stopped surviving in most regions altogether. Enoch is a perfect example. It was clearly influential early on. The New Testament book of Jude directly quotes it in verses 14 and 15, attributing the quote to Enoch, the 7th from Adam, but Enoch never made it into the canon that hardened in the Greek and Latin churches. In most of the Mediterranean world, complete copies of Enoch simply vanished. For centuries, Western scholars knew Enoch only through a handful of fragmentary quotations preserved by other ancient writers. Except in Ethiopia. Their complete Guizi manuscripts of Enoch kept being copied, generation after generation, precisely because Ethiopia's canon had solidified around a broader Alexandrian-influenced Old Testament tradition and had never gone through the narrowing process that happened elsewhere. When European scholars finally rediscovered the Book of Enoch in the late 18th century, they found it specifically because a Scottish traveler named James Bruce brought Ethiopic manuscripts back from Ethiopia in 1773. The first complete English translation, by Richard Lawrence, wasn't published until 1821, and the discovery of Enoch fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in the mid-20th century, in the original Aramaic, confirmed that Ethiopia's Guizi text really did preserve, with remarkable fidelity, a document that had genuinely circulated among Jewish communities in the last centuries BC. That's not a fringe claim. That's mainstream biblical scholarship, backed by manuscript evidence. This is worth getting right because the actual content of these texts is stranger and more interesting than most of the invented prophecy content circulating online. 1 Enoch is not a book about end-time spiritual conditions or 7 interior seals of the heart. It's an apocalyptic and cosmological text, likely composed in stages between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century BC, built around the figure of Enoch, the antediluvian patriarch mentioned briefly in Genesis 5 as someone who walked with God and was taken up without dying. The book expands wildly on that. Its most famous section describes the Watchers, angelic beings who descend to earth, take human wives, and father a race of giants called the Nephilim, teaching forbidden knowledge, metalworking, weapons, cosmetics, astrology, sorcery, to humanity in the process. God responds by sending the flood and binding the offending angels until final judgment. Later sections offer detailed cosmological tours, the mechanics of the sun, moon, winds, and stars, and a long apocalyptic vision using a code of animals to represent the sweep of biblical history. Its vivid, strange literature and its themes about angelic rebellion and forbidden knowledge influenced later Jewish and Christian ideas about fallen angels far more than most people realize. Jubilees retells the events of Genesis and part of Exodus, from creation through Moses at Sinai, organized around a 364-day solar calendar that the book insists is the only correct religious calendar, a position that put it at odds with the lunar-based calendars used elsewhere in the ancient Jewish world. It's sometimes called the Little Genesis. Scholars generally date it to the 2nd century BC, and like Enoch, fragments of it turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirming its antiquity and its popularity in at least some Jewish circles of the period. The Maccabean books 1, 2, and 3 are genuinely distinct from both the Hebrew Bible's absence of Maccabees and the Greek 1 to 4 Maccabees found in Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Old Testaments. Despite the similar-sounding name, Ethiopian Maccabean tells different stories about different kings and different conflicts. It's a case where translation and naming across languages created lasting confusion. Many people assume Ethiopian Maccabees must overlap with the Maccabees history familiar from a Hanukkah story, and it mostly doesn't. The Book of the Covenant, the Synodos, the Ethiopic Didascalia, and the Clementine writings in the New Testament portion of the canon are church order documents, texts concerned with the structure of clergy, the conduct of worship, rules for fasting, and instructions attributed, in various layers of tradition, to the apostles or to early bishops like Clement of Rome. The Didascalia in particular exists in versions used by several ancient churches and largely concerns pastoral discipline and community organization, not hidden end-times prophecy. These are real, catalog documents you can find described in academic works by scholars like J.M. Hardin, who published an English edition of the Ethiopic Didascalia back in 1920. They're valuable as a window into how the early church actually organized itself. They are not secret apocalyptic manuscripts about a final empire or 7 seals of the heart. That framing simply isn't in them. None of this needs a fabricated celebrity endorsement or an invented prophecy to be worth people's attention. The real story carries plenty on its own. It says something significant that the size and shape of the Bible isn't a fixed universal fact. It's a historical outcome, shaped by which communities had power, which languages spread, which manuscripts got copied, and which didn't, and which regions stayed in close contact with the centers where canon debates played out. The Ethiopian case is maybe the clearest surviving example of a Christian tradition that took a genuinely different branch at that fork and kept walking down it for a millennium and a half without ever being forced back onto the main road. It also means that texts like Enoch and Jubilees, which shaped ideas that quietly echo through later Jewish mysticism, early Christian angelology, and even some threads of Islamic tradition, didn't just disappear into myth. They kept being read, copied, debated, and taught continuously in one place, by one community, the entire time the rest of the world thought they were lost. When Western scholars rediscovered them in the 18th and 19th centuries, they weren't unearthing something dead. They were finally catching up to a living tradition that had never stopped. And it's a reminder that apocryphal doesn't mean fake, and canonical doesn't mean universal. Different communities of faith, acting in good conscience over centuries, arrived at different answers to a genuinely hard question, which ancient writings carry real spiritual authority. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's answer has always included more books than most of the Christian world settled on. That's not a scandal to be sensationalized. It's a data point in the actual, complicated, well-documented history of how Scripture took shape, one that deserves to be understood on its own terms rather than repackaged as a suppressed secret with invented prophecies stapled onto it. If you want to go further, the real path is straightforward. Guizi translations of Enoch, Jubilees, and the Maccabean books exist in published English editions from serious academic presses, and the scholarly literature on the Ethiopian canon, from R.W. Cowley's foundational 1974 article to more recent work by scholars like Daniel Asefa, is openly available to anyone willing to read it. No hidden monastery required. Just a library and a willingness to sit with a tradition that was never actually hiding, only waiting for the rest of the world to bother asking. The story begins with an object that doesn't exist, a scroll, unnamed, uncatalogued, said to have surfaced in a monastery that isn't on any map. Call it what you like. The tale changes depending on who tells it. In this version, it appears in the hands of an old librarian named Tesfaye, who claims to have found it wedged behind a shelf of hymnals in a building that had burned twice and been rebuilt twice, as though the scroll had simply waited out the fires. Tesfaye never said where it came from. He said only that it read like something written for people who hadn't been born yet. And when pressed, by scholars, by skeptics, by the merely curious, he would only say the same thing. It isn't a record of what happened. It's a warning about what hasn't happened yet. Whether Tesfaye existed at all is beside the point. What matters is the text he supposedly carried and what it says. The scroll in this story describes 4 ages that every civilization eventually walks through, whether it notices or not. The first it calls the Age of Forgetting. Not a war, not a collapse, something quieter. A people begin to lose interest in the questions that used to keep them up at night. They stop noticing the space between what they believe and what they actually do. Convenience starts to matter more than truth, not because anyone decided it should, but because nobody was paying close enough attention to stop it. The second is the Age of Spectacle. Here the text says noise becomes a kind of medicine. People fill their days with distraction not because they're happy, but because stillness has started to feel unbearable. The text doesn't condemn entertainment itself. It condemns the exhaustion underneath it, the sense that a whole civilization has forgotten how to sit with an uncomfortable thought for longer than a few seconds. The third is the Age of the Hollow Shepherd. This is the age the scroll spends the most ink on. It describes